We all have that urge sometimes to just completely disappear from the world. Life gets incredibly busy, the noise of the city becomes overwhelming, and you just want to find a quiet place where nobody can reach you. For one young man, this urge became so strong last winter that he decided to take a few days off from his demanding job. He loaded up his pickup truck with all his heavy winter camping gear, packed plenty of food, and decided to make the journey deep into a massive state forest. He brought along his incredibly loyal and energetic dog, a large dog named Roscoe. Roscoe was the kind of dog that loved the outdoors, always full of energy and always alert to his surroundings. Together, the two of them drove away from the city lights, leaving the constant buzz of modern life far behind. The drive itself took them up a very long and extremely narrow trail that cut deep into the heart of the state forest. The road was barely maintained, and as they went deeper, it became entirely covered in packed snow and thick ice. The tires of the pickup truck crunched loudly against the frozen ground, and the young man looked out the window, realizing there were absolutely no other cars anywhere in sight. There were no tire tracks ahead of him, and no signs of life behind him. After driving for almost an hour along this treacherous icy road, he finally spotted a small pull-off area. It looked like it had not been used by anyone in a very long time, as the snow there was deep and undisturbed. He carefully parked his truck, turned off the engine, and let the sudden, heavy silence of the winter forest wash over him. From that point, they could not drive any further. They had to hike. He strapped on his heavy backpack, adjusted his gear, and began walking into the woods with Roscoe leading the way. They hiked for about 20 minutes, walking deeper and deeper into the quiet trees, until they reached a small, beautiful clearing, surrounded by incredibly thick, tall, evergreen trees. The snow in this clearing was deep and completely untouched. There were absolutely no footprints, no animal tracks, and no signs of any other human being having been there recently. This was exactly the kind of perfect isolation he had been searching for. As soon as they arrived in the clearing, the young man set his heavy backpack down on the snow and took a deep breath of the cold winter air. He cleared a large spot in the snow to set up his tent, while Roscoe happily wandered around the perimeter of the clearing. The dog was sniffing the snow, exploring the edges of the trees, and jumping around playfully, clearly enjoying the freedom of the wilderness. The young man worked quickly because he knew the winter sun would be setting soon, and once the darkness hit, the temperature would drop rapidly. He pitched his sturdy winter tent, making sure to stake it down incredibly hard into the frozen ground. It took a lot of effort because the dirt beneath the snow was hard as rock, but he wanted to make sure the tent was secure against any harsh night winds. Inside the tent, he carefully laid out his insulated sleeping pad and a heavy winter-rated sleeping bag. He knew it was going to be a cold night, well below freezing, so he made sure he was layered properly. He kept his thermal base layers on, put on thick wool socks, a warm fleece jacket, and kept his heavy winter coat zipped up, even after the entire campsite was set up. Once the tent was fully prepared, he turned his attention to building a fire. He gathered dead wood and dry branches from the surrounding trees and built a small, sturdy fire pit in the center of the clearing. He started the fire, watching the small sparks catch on the dry wood, and let it burn down until he had a steady, warm flame. He cooked a simple dinner over the fire, the smell of the warm food drifting through the cold air. He sat down on a log near the flames, eating his meal while Roscoe lay quietly in the snow right next to him. The woods were incredibly quiet in that deep winter way where sound feels almost non-existent. He remembered a lesson his father had taught him a long time ago, which was that snow actually acts like a natural sound sponge, absorbing all the ambient noise and making the wilderness feel even more silent than usual. It was peaceful, but also slightly eerie. Just as he finished his dinner and was starting to relax, Roscoe suddenly stood up. The dog was completely rigid, his ears perked up, and he started barking sharply toward the dark tree line. At first, the young man did not think much of it. Deer and other wild animals were everywhere out in these woods, and Roscoe had barked at them before during hikes. He calmly told the dog to relax and quiet down. After a minute of staring into the dark, Roscoe finally calmed down and sat back down by the fire, but he still seemed slightly tense. The young man checked the time on his phone and decided he would stay up just a little bit longer by the warm fire before turning in for the night. He always carried a handgun in a holster at his hip, whenever he went camping in remote areas, and he patted the side of his belt just to remind himself it was there. He felt completely fine and safe at that point, believing they were entirely alone. But about 20 minutes later, Roscoe suddenly stood up again. This time, the dog did not just bark. He let out a loud, aggressive bark, and then the young man heard it too. It was the distinct sound of footsteps moving slowly through the deep snow somewhere out in the dark woods. The young man stood up immediately, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He listened closely. The footsteps stopped. Then they started again, moving slowly. Roscoe went from barking to a low, menacing growl, and then suddenly the dog went completely silent. He just stood there, staring straight ahead into the thick trees. That was when the young man felt uneasy. He followed his dog's intense gaze and saw a dark shape standing right at the edge of the tree line. Someone was standing there, half hidden in the deep shadows, just barely illuminated by the flickering light of the campfire. The young man tried to keep his voice steady as he called out into the darkness. He said that the person had really scared him, and then he softly told Roscoe that everything was okay, trying to keep the dog calm. The figure in the shadows did not move at first. He just stood there, completely still, watching them. Then the figure stepped forward just enough for the campfire light to reveal his face. It was a man, dressed in dark winter clothing, but he did not look like an ordinary hiker. He looked disheveled, and his expression was completely blank. He asked the young man what he was doing out there so deep in the woods. His voice did not sound friendly at all. It was cold and accusatory. The young man replied as calmly as he could, saying he was just getting out into nature with his dog for a couple of days. The stranger did not respond right away. He just stood there, staring intensely, making no effort to explain who he was or why he was out there in the middle of a frozen forest with no gear. The young man could feel the entire situation turning incredibly dangerous. He slowly placed his hand near his hip and told the man calmly but firmly that he was armed. The stranger did not seem intimidated at all. He let out a low, unsettling laugh and made a comment about the young man threatening him, instead of inviting him to join the fire, asking where his hospitality was. Then, without another word, the man turned around and walked back into the pitch-black woods, his footsteps slowly fading away into the silence. The young man stood by the fire for a very long time after that, staring into the dark trees where the man had disappeared. Roscoe stayed glued to his side, his body tense. The young man did not like any of this, but eventually he tried to convince himself that the stranger was gone and had just been some weird local passing through. He knew he could not stay outside anymore, so he carefully put out the fire. He threw heavy shovels of snow onto the hot coals, stirring the ashes until there was absolutely nothing left that could glow or give away his location in the dark. He did not want any light drawing attention to his campsite. He crawled inside his tent, zipped up the heavy doors, and did everything he could to prepare for the freezing night. He made sure his sleeping pad kept his body elevated off the cold ground, stayed fully dressed in his winter clothes, pulled a knit hat tightly over his ears, and cinched his sleeping bag tight around his shoulders. He activated a couple of chemical hand warmers, placing one near his chest and another near his feet. Roscoe curled up right next to him, and the dog's body heat was the only thing that brought him any real comfort. He lay there in the pitch black, listening to the absolute silence of the woods. But that silence did not last very long. After what felt like hours of laying awake, Roscoe suddenly started growling again, a low vibration-like sound in his throat. Then the young man heard exactly what the dog was growling at. It was the sound of heavy footsteps crunching in the snow outside. The footsteps stopped, and Roscoe quieted down for a second, though his ears remained completely perked up in the dark. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were much closer, and they were moving incredibly slowly, much slower than before. They came directly up to the side of the tent, and then stopped right there, just inches away from where the young man was laying. Roscoe immediately lost his temper and began howling loudly, barking at the thin fabric of the tent. The young man desperately whispered for his dog to stop, terrified that the loud noise would provoke the person outside. When Roscoe finally stopped howling, he went back to a low, intense growl. Whoever was standing outside just remained there, completely still. The young man could hear the subtle shifting of weight in the snow, the soft rustle of winter clothing. He now had his handgun out of his holster, holding it tightly in his hand, pointing it toward the tent wall. He did not want to make threats because he was terrified of being forced to follow through. He had never shot anyone in his life, and he did not know if he had it in him to take a life, even in self-defense. Finally, the tension became too much to bear. The young man could not take the terrifying silence anymore. He pulled back the slide of his gun, letting the loud, metallic click echo inside the small tent. He called out loudly and clearly, saying that he had a gun and that whoever was standing outside needed to leave his campsite immediately. Deep down, he knew there was no one else it could be besides that creepy stranger from earlier. There was a long, agonizing silence for a few seconds. Then, thankfully, he heard the sound of footsteps moving away from the tent. They started slowly at first, and then began moving much faster, crunching through the snow until they completely disappeared into the deep woods. The young man did not dare to unzip the tent or look outside. He stayed frozen in his sleeping bag, holding his gun for the rest of the night. Roscoe remained completely alert, sitting upright and watching the tent door. That was the only reason the young man was even able to briefly nod off for short, fitful bursts of sleep. If he had been alone, he would have stayed awake the entire night. When the sky finally began to lighten with the very first rays of dawn, he did not hesitate. He packed up his gear as fast as he physically could, threw everything into his backpack, and hiked back to his pickup truck with Roscoe. They got in, drove down the icy trail, and never looked back. The young man never went back to that forest, realizing that sometimes the scariest predators in the woods are not wild animals, but the people who lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, though, you do not have to go deep into the frozen wilderness to encounter something deeply disturbing. It can happen in a bustling, beautiful historic city, surrounded by thousands of tourists. That is exactly what happened during the July 4th holiday weekend in the summer of 2025. A young man decided to take a road trip, driving from Melbourne, Florida, to Charleston, South Carolina. He went to visit a very close friend named Mark, who was living in a house in the city for a law program internship. The young man was staying for the weekend and sleeping downstairs on a couch by some windows. After a smooth drive, he arrived, and they played pickleball before nightfall. The couch downstairs faced another apartment building and a small labyrinth of alleyways with an abandoned house across the street. The next day, after playing more pickleball in the morning, they went to the main Charleston market. The market was a sensory overload, filled with the rich aroma of sweetgrass baskets being woven by local artisans, the smell of roasted nuts, and the constant hum of hundreds of overlapping conversations. Yet, amidst all this life, a figure across the street was like a cold shadow. They walked through the market and came out near the docks. That was when they saw him. A man in a wedding suit was shambling down the road near the water. He wore a crisp bow tie and clean dress shoes, and his suit looked freshly pressed. He had long black curly hair and a tan complexion. The market behind them was loud and busy, yet this man moved alone with a slow, detached movement. He did not notice them and seemed to be in his own world. Instinctively, the young man wanted to avoid him. He grabbed Mark by the arm and told him they were not crossing the street. They walked to the right, deeper into the city, and picked up their pace. He told Mark it was strange and that the guy did not look homeless. His clothes were too clean and crisp. Something about him felt wrong. Mark agreed. They kept walking for a while. A few streets later on, another busy stretch of Charleston, they looked toward a shop and saw him again. That same man with the same shambling movement, far down the street, diagonal to them, moving at the same slow pace. Somehow he caught up to them, even though there was no clear way he could have reached that spot without them seeing him. They pointed him out, stared, and found it made no sense. They pushed it aside and kept exploring. The next day was July 4th, and they watched fireworks on an island about 20 minutes from the city. By then they had mostly forgotten about him, assuming he was just a strange person wandering around. But something about him set off alarm bells. The next night, July 5th, they went on a planned ghost tour. The ghost tour itself took them through some of the oldest, darkest streets of Charleston, where the guide whispered tales of tragic historical events, piracy, and restless spirits that supposedly still walked the cobblestones. Normally, the young man would have found these stories amusing, but after seeing the shambling wedding suit man earlier, the atmosphere felt genuinely heavy and ominous. After finishing the tour, They walked through the main area, filled with restaurants and nightlife. The street was crowded, and a large group of people was moving toward them quite fast. As this group approached, both Mark and the young man noticed something at the exact same moment. It was him, the same man in the same wedding suit, with the same bow tie and curly hair, shambling in the middle of the crowd as if he had been placed there. He stood out instantly, his movement completely different. No one around him noticed him. Two people walked right beside him, and he brushed between them without either reacting. He kept the same slow, unsettling pace while everyone else moved normally around him. He glanced at them for a brief second and continued forward. They watched him move down the street until the crowd thinned, still shambling at that unnatural pace, before disappearing into a darker side street. Unsettled, they returned to the house. Mark went upstairs, and the young man went downstairs to sleep on the couch, shutting the blinds. In the middle of the night, he woke up to a tap on the window. He froze, then lifted the blind slightly. At the far end of the alley, he saw the back of the man turning the corner. Right before disappearing, the man looked back toward the window. He told Mark the next morning, and even Mark, who was extremely logical, was shaken. The young man drove home to Florida on July 6th, but the image of the man turning the corner stayed with him. While public encounters can be creepy, nothing compares to the terror of realizing your own home has been compromised. A young man lived alone in a small house he bought a few years ago. His routine was predictable. He worked from home, ordered groceries, went to the gym late at night, and did not talk to neighbors. It started with a noise around 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. He was half asleep on the couch when he heard a soft thump near the back of the house. He muted the TV, listened, but nothing else happened. So he checked the back door, made sure it was locked, and went to bed. The next morning, the back door handle felt loose, like it had been twisted too hard. That night, he went to the gym around 11 and got back around midnight. His porch light was off, though he always left it on. Inside, everything looked normal, but he did a quick walkthrough anyway. On Thursday morning, his phone was at 12% battery. He always charged it overnight. The cable was in his phone, but the charger was unplugged from the wall. He assumed he must have pulled it loose in his sleep. That night, he stayed up listening in the dark. Around 3, he heard slow thumps from the back of the house. He convinced himself it was outside noise. The next day, he found muddy shoe prints near the back door. They were smudged, as if someone tried to wipe them off. He also noticed scratch marks around the lock. He called a locksmith, who replaced the lock that afternoon. The locksmith was a middle-aged man with a friendly demeanor, and as he worked on replacing the lock, he made small talk, asking if the young man had been having trouble with key extraction. The young man just nodded quietly, too embarrassed to admit the real, terrifying reason he wanted. The locks changed so urgently. That night he pushed a chair under the door handle and locked his bedroom door. At 4 in the morning he heard a light tapping on his bedroom door, like someone testing it with fingertips. He stayed still, and the tapping stopped as footsteps moved away. In the morning, the chair was still under the handle, but the back door itself was completely unlocked. The new lock had just been turned from the inside. He called the police, but they found no signs of forced entry and suggested he might have unlocked it in his sleep. That night, he stayed awake with the lights on and a kitchen knife on the table. At 2 in the morning, he heard a noise from the basement. The basement door was cracked open. He walked over, peeked down, and saw the outline of someone standing on the stairs. He slammed the door, ran to his car, and called 911. The police arrived quickly, and when the officers descended the narrow stairs with their flashlights drawn, the young man waited outside, his breath visible in the cold night air. He could hear their heavy boots thudding against the concrete floor below, and the muffled sound of things being moved around as they conducted a thorough search. They arrested a barefoot man in dark clothes. He did not look at the young man as they led him away. The officers found food wrappers, water bottles, a phone charger, and an insulation sleeping pad behind the furnace in the basement. The man had been living there, using the young man's gym schedule to come upstairs. Days later, the young man found a photo on his phone taken at 3:11 in the morning of him sleeping. The intruder had stood over him, unplugged his phone, and taken the photo. He was charged with stalking and registered as a sex offender. Now, Let us trace how these cases finally resolved, because while the arrest of a trespasser or the departure of a strange figure offers some physical relief, the mental scars do not heal so easily. The legal process for the home intruder was slow, dragging out over several months. It turns out that the man had been squatting in several abandoned properties in the area before finding the unlocked basement access of the young man's house. Because of the digital photo evidence, the defense had very little room to negotiate. The prosecution was able to secure a conviction for felony stalking, breaking and entering, and illegal surveillance. The man was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and as the police promised, was placed on the sex offender registry for life. For the young man, the victory felt hollow. He spent weeks installing a state-of-the-art security system with motion sensors, cameras in every room, and heavy-duty reinforced locks on every entrance. Yet, every single time he hears a creak in his floorboards, or every time his phone battery is slightly lower than he expects, his heart stops. The psychological damage of having your personal space invaded in such an intimate way is a life sentence of its own. As for the first story, the lonely camper who faced down a stranger in the frozen woods, he never did find out who that man was. He made a report to the local forest rangers, describing the disheveled man and the aggressive stalking behavior. The rangers checked the area, but found no active camps or registered hikers matching that description. It is highly likely the stranger was either a drifter living illegally in the deep forest, or someone with deeply malicious intent, looking for vulnerable targets. The young man decided to stick to busy, established campgrounds from that day on, never again seeking the extreme isolation he once craved. He realized that the silence of the woods is beautiful, but it also means that no one can hear you scream. And finally, the strange wedding suit man of Charleston remains one of the most bizarre unsolved mysteries of the young man's life. He and Mark searched local news reports, social media forums, and local police blotters for weeks afterward, trying to see if anyone else had encountered the shambling man in the wedding dress. They found a few obscure online posts from other tourists who had visited Charleston around the same time. These posts described a silent, slow-moving man in a pristine suit who seemed to ignore the crowds and appear in different parts of the city with impossible speed. Some locals speculated it was a performance artist, while others believed it was something far more sinister, perhaps a scout for a local pickpocket ring, or something else entirely. No matter what the truth was, both Mark and the young man still talk about that weekend. The haunting memory of that pale, silent face looking back toward the window in the dead of night is something that will forever remain with them for the rest of their days. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.